So today we're in an interesting place, the last kind of bit of teaching today before next week, which is Palm Sunday, and we have Jesus entering Jerusalem. So it's a last kind of minute here in the build-up for the climax of what Jesus has been telling his disciples about, and we get to the Jerusalem account and all that we are experiencing. It's an interesting time where we get to see Jesus, the love that Jesus has for his children play out in this emotive way. So I'm going to read you the whole story because it all really needs to be heard together. And then we'll go back and focus on just a couple of parts. This is probably a story that most of you are somewhat familiar with, but let's try to listen carefully to it today. I find one thing that I hadn't really noticed until I looked at this painting and picked it for today, and that is that the very end of the text that I'm going to read to you, basically it has Jesus telling them, can you unbind him now? I raised him from the dead. Is there any way you can take the bandages off? Because he can't really walk around. Anyway, so there's lots of evidence in this large text that I think probably most of us halfway know. So this is the death of Lazarus, and I'm going to be reading it from the NIV. John 11 starts like this. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. When he heard this, Jesus said, the sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days, and then he said to his disciple, let's go back to Judea. But Rabbi, they said, a short while ago the Jews were there, and they tried to stone you, and you're going to go back? And Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by the world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light. After he had said this, they went on to tell him, our friend Lazarus is asleep, but I'm going there. Or he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up. His disciples replied, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better. Jesus had been speaking of his death, but the disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him. And then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, let us also go, that we may die with him. Well, on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. And when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who was come into the world. After she said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord." Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "How he loved him." But some of them said, Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more, deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said the sister of the dead man, "by this time there's odor, for he's been there 4 days." Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" And so they took away the stone, and Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." And when he said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." And the dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and cloth around his face. And Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him. Friends, this is God's word for us, God's precious things. Thanks be to God. So, I'm sure most of you remember at least bits and pieces of stories. And this is honestly the case with most stories. There's so much going on, it's a little bit hard to decide what we're going to think about on a given day. But I decided to go kind of right to, or at least begin with, we usually think about in this whole text, and that is this persistent Bible trivia question. I'm sure you noticed it. 11:35, where Jesus gives us the answer to what is the short Bible, at least it's translated into English, right? At least in the NIV and the King James, other versions add a few more words, but it says Jesus wept. Right? The shortest verse in the Bible, short but powerful. Certainly powerful to anyone who's ever experienced loss, which is all of us, right? If you live long enough, it's not something that any of us get to steer around in our lives. We all have to confront loss. We all have to confront death. And when we do, this is a comforting, if tiny little verse, which on its surface at least gives us the idea that Jesus feels the same hurt that we do, right? So we can feel the empathy that Jesus has for not just humanity, but here his friends, right? This is a family of friends that Jesus has. Of course, I think there's a lot more going on here than this. First, if we look at the situation itself, we have to wonder, I think, about the emotions of Jesus just a little bit. So it's a question that always comes up. If Jesus is so sad at what he sees, why did he do nothing? This is the same question that Mary and Martha have. Why did you not turn up? So all of these feelings of sadness and loss could have been prevented if Jesus had just come and saved him. Surely Jesus has the power to do that. And we have to wonder in this. So the text tells us why Jesus might do this to make a point, right? Jesus is making a point. But I think larger than that, we have to wonder here, or at least I wonder, if the tears of Jesus here don't have something to do with the way Jesus does what he does in this scene. He lets Lazarus die and his friends be in pain when clearly he could have stopped it. Right? So this is a question. We've been thinking about this in our Bible studies over the past couple of weeks. This question of why is there evil in the world? Why is there pain in the world when clearly God can fix all of this stuff? And I don't want to say that this is necessarily an answer to that, but I do have to wonder if when Jesus weeps, it's not just empathy, but it's Jesus feeling hurt because he has let his children hurt. Right? If you think about how much we love our own children, right? And how much we would hurt if we did something that actually let them hurt. If we could have fixed it, but we didn't. Right? And we let them experience this terrible pain. Right? How much would we hurt if we don't cause, but don't fix, when we could, our children's hurt, right? So I wonder if that is that a component of the tears of Jesus? I don't know. It's hard not to think about it. And we've been thinking about, maybe I went there because we've been thinking about this question for weeks in multiple Bible studies, both our one on Monday night and elsewhere. But I think there's also another option. At least one more option. There's dozens, I'm positive. There's another option I think also might be true, because I'm sure the two first options are true. Right? It's not pick one or the other. I think they're both true. But I think there's another option. And this is, what if along with the empathy of God, of this God that dwells among us and has for God's self earthly friends, right? That's the story we read. This is God walking around human friends, which is kind of blows your mind at the outset. But what if it's more than just this empathy, right? Along with this empathy of a God that would come and live and dwell among us, and also along with this pain God might feel because God didn't stop the pain that he sees in these children that he loves. What if along with that we're also seeing some of the holiness of Jesus described? What if we're getting a little bit of a glimpse into the holiness of Jesus here? What if Jesus is simply disturbed by death itself? From the creation account, which, if we believe John, Jesus was, from the creation account onward, from Genesis or from John, we weren't intended to die. This was not what God wanted for us. Of course, God knew the way this would play out. But for Jesus, in fact, who has just told Martha that he's the resurrection and the life, death is something antithetical to him. Death is something outside of God. Death is something outside of who Jesus is. Jesus doesn't say that he can bring the resurrection. Jesus doesn't say that he can bring life. Jesus defines himself. I am, using the I am statement from Mount Sinai when we're asked God's name and God says, thank you very much. Jesus claims that statement here and says, I am the resurrection and the life. He is these things. He doesn't just bring these things. So, friends, is there a chance then that Jesus, who is the way and the truth and the life, might be disturbed by another way? Not his way, be disturbed by another way. That he might be disturbed by something other than truth. He might be disturbed by lies and deceit. And if those things are true, which I think we would agree that those things are true, if he's the way and the truth and the life, then he's likely also disturbed by what is not life, and that is death. At it that way. I hadn't until this week. What if part of the reaction we have of Jesus here and the words we have Jesus saying is due to his really not wanting to come close to death? But yet he does. Right? Jesus here, because of his love for his children, only because of his love for his children, just as he does on the Mount of Olives, like there, as he does on the Mount of Olives, just as he does on the cross, Jesus here in this story of Lazarus goes face to face with death that is antithetical to him, that is this thing that is so not God. Why? Because we are in pain in this place. Jesus goes to interact with death because we are in pain in death. Y'all, I love this tiny verse for all it shows. All it shows us, even on its very surface, about the compassion of Jesus. But when you read it this way, when you read it, Jesus goes to death, even though it is so outside of what he is, if he's the way and the truth and the life, that he goes face to face with death because we are there in pain. That makes this verse especially hard to hear, doesn't it? It's like that verse in How Great Thou Art. There's half of us are in tears when we sing that together. When I think that God, his Son not sparing, sent him to die, I scarce can take it in. Right? The second or third verse, depending on what hymnal you're using. When we think of Jesus, friends, as the resurrection, again, not as bringing, but as being, who is the resurrection and who is the life, coming to face with death because we are in pain there, I dare say we scarcely can take it in. And I really think that there is something to this interpretation. Because the verse that usually is read as Jesus being deeply moved or troubled or translated this way to kind of meet the surface reading of the text, but is probably better translated instead of deeply. It's probably better translated deeply moved or troubled. Is probably better translated that Jesus is really agitated. Jesus is really disturbed at what he sees. And I think, I know this is the translation that we should be hearing because we see this in Jesus' reaction. Right? We see this in his words and the way this plays out. You hear it in his reaction to being pulled into this interaction by Mary and Martha, who honestly are fairly accusatory of God walking around in human form. They are fairly accusatory of the God-man, Jesus. Martha is first, and then Mary kind of follows, who in effect says, hey, if you'd bothered turning up, none of this would have happened. Jesus, thanks a lot, because he's dead now. And how does Jesus reply to that? How does he respond? He responds by saying, well, if you had some faith, maybe you'd notice that God is doing something. Right? Jesus kind of claps back at her. Lazarus wouldn't have died if your father turning up, Jesus. Thanks a lot. And Jesus was like, maybe God does something here if you pay attention. How about a little faith? Which is something I think we've all experienced in a way with friend or family or with God. I've done with all of those things. In the middle of some crisis, we lose our filter and we just say stuff, right? Or at least I do. My filter's not so thick anyway. It's pretty easy to lose. But in the middle of crisis, it is what we do, especially with those who we trust and love and care about, right? We have a tendency to just say stuff in the middle of crisis. And as you know, most of the time this makes relationships stronger. We've talked about that. Well, what if, friends, this crisis, the death of Mary and Martha's brother, and then they're calling Jesus into action that he may not want to get into, and then his response to that, what if this is somehow representative of our lives of faith? Because I think it is. I think this is representative of our lives of faith, in which we are all, at times, Mary and Martha, asking, hey, God, if you'd maybe turn up, right? If you'd maybe show up, I wouldn't be hurting like I do. Right? If you'd maybe turn up. If you'd maybe turn up, I wouldn't be hungry like I am. If you'd bother showing up, I wouldn't feel broken and alone like I do. If you'd bother turning up. Well, what if when we call on Jesus in this way, we heard him answer back the way he answered back with Martha? That we might just see the glory of God if we would believe. We might just see God working. Which is exactly what Jesus asked Martha to do. No? Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? This is Jesus' word. The red letters. Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So if that's Jesus' stance, why would we think that Jesus either demands less from us? Why would we think that Jesus either demands less from us, or that Jesus loves us less, or is any less able to be in our lives and change our lives? Here on this fifth Sunday of Lent, our last Sunday before Jesus enters Jerusalem to again come face to face with death, for those he loves, Jesus seems to be giving us this last little bit of teaching, telling us that our faith is somehow connected intimately with our ability to see God, that our faith is connected in an inseparable way to our ability to perceive God work around us. And even more so that as we journey towards the cross, that Jesus is telling us that we can call on him to show us the glory of God if we believe. That we can call on him to show us God's working. That faith is at least ordinarily a prerequisite to see God's glory. Is it not possible, friends, from what Jesus is saying here in this last little bit before he makes his way to Jerusalem next week, is it not possible that Jesus is saying that to see God rightly, we need faith? To see God in the way that God can change our lives, we need faith. I want to think that it's waking up, that it's like waking up in the morning without your glasses on. So I wake up sometimes, I didn't do it this morning, but I wake up some mornings and I'm so excited to get downstairs and get some coffee. I'll just roll out and leave my glasses on the nightstand. And when I get downstairs, I can't tell whether I'm picking up a decaf pod, which is blasphemy in my house. But they exist for some, I don't know why we have them. No one wants them, but they're there in our little dish. I could pick up a decaf pod by accident. I don't know when I'm pressing the little dot, I don't know what am I selecting a half am I selecting a latte, a cappuccino, a flat white? I don't know what I'm getting. I can't see the glory of my latte properly because I don't have glasses on. You see where I'm going? It's a stretch, I know. And so I got to go back upstairs at this point. I got to go back, like, okay, I'm failing at this. So here I go back upstairs, and I get my glasses. Of course, when I go back upstairs, now for the second time, Duke. Yeah. Now Duke is rumbling around. So now he's my problem. Now I can't even do the coffee, right? I got to take him out. I got to take him for a walk. I got to change his bowls out. I got to give him this whole list of stuff that I need to do to be able to enjoy my coffee rightly. But it turns out that there's no shortcuts. There aren't any shortcuts for me to be able to make the white that I want in the morning. This is the process. Rightly. This morning, Jesus tells us that we need faith to see God rightly. That there aren't shortcuts. That we need to practice this thing. That we need to engage this thing. Of course, faith is quite a bit more powerful than my glasses. Because faith not only allows us to see, but seems to be able to open up new ways for us to see even deeper and more rightly. Our faith seems to be a kind of a feedback loop that more and more, over and over, new ways of seeing God in our world as we engage. We see that here with Mary and Martha. We see it in the mother of Jesus at the beginning of John's gospel, at the wedding of Cana, right? We see it in Job. I think we talked about Job last week. Well, Job's here again with us this week. Job's a good example of this. Calling on God to show up. Over and over, calling on God to show up. And when God finally does show up at the end of, what does God tell Job out of this whirlwind? He gives him ways to increase his faith. He gives him ways to grow closer to God. And how does this all begin for Job or Mary and Martha or any of them? It begins with questions, right? It begins with tears. It begins with the sisters calling Jesus into their fragile lives. Not with knowing the answer to every theological question. Not with perfect faith. but with brokenness. And faith within that brokenness. Faith within that brokenness that calls out for Jesus to come and let us know that he's near. And y'all, this is what Jesus asks of us. This is what Jesus asks of us, not to be perfect, but simply to love, let him love us. All Jesus asks is to love him enough to let him love us. To have enough faith in him that we believe that he might actually turn up. To have enough faith in him that we might believe that he will turn up and can do something to change our lives. That he can, that he is willing, and that he is able to do something about our pain. That by calling him into our lives, he might have a chance to call us closer and to show us his glory. Today, friends, in this fairly long story, these two words stand out, right? Jesus weeps, which tells a lot about who Jesus is, a lot about the empathy of Jesus. It tells us a lot about his hurt and seeing his children hurt, and maybe it tells us a lot about his disdain for death. But after the tears, friends, he suggests that if we believe, we will see the glory of God. May this be for us true as we approach his cross.